Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to do quick studies of the figure using only pen and ink. While these are technically gesture drawings, I hesitate to call them that because the word conjures images of fast, super expressive drawings in charcoal which emphasize capturing movement at the expense of just about everything else. Such work has its place, but to my mind, there are many other ways to do quick studies, especially when they're intended not as ends in themselves, but rather as practice for longer, more finished work. While capturing gesture is still a priority, I use these kinds of exercises to work on a number of other crucial skills. The first is to learn to break the figure down into simple volumes. The second is to develop an instinct for proportion. The third is to utilize line in a way that emphasizes anatomy, depth, and value. And lastly, to practice the basic building blocks of shading. The last thing I'd like to say before we start is that I'm unfortunately not going to be able to provide the original references I'm working from. My plan is to eventually, if there's growing interest in my figure drawing instruction, to license images that can be shared with you here. But for now, I think there's still plenty to be learned even without the original references. Okay, let's get started on these really important exercises. Okay, let's start with the first pose, which is standing, but is complicated by the fact that it has a really strong bend to it. The first step is to break down the figure into very simple volumes: ovals, cylinders, cones, and spheres. So I'm looking for big angles. So her head is tilted back, going this way. Then the cylinder of her neck is going like this. And then I notice that her ribcage has a little bit of a tilt to it. And then to make sure I capture the gesture, as soon as I find the pit of the neck, I'm going to indicate it and drop a vertical line down like this. And then I'm going to pay very close attention to where the legs line up against this line. So I'm going to start drawing the waist. Right? I'm paying attention to where this line lines up against her groin. Right? So her entire body has this kind of sinuous curve going this way. And then when I start placing the cone shape of the legs, I'm paying attention to where it lines up against my center of gravity. That is the key to getting the gesture right. This leg is going back like this, and she's standing on her tiptoes with the other leg. Now, for the shoulders, I'm using little egg shapes. They're about 3/4 the size of the head. And again, using very, very simple volumes. Cone shapes, egg shapes, cylinders, spheres, and cones. For the hands, I use little blocks. For the feet, you can see I've already done it. I use little wedge shapes. Let me adjust the angle of the head. I'm a little bit off here. And then, something really important, I'm going to get the rotation of each one of these forms by drawing the center line. So her head is doing this, her ribcage is doing this, her hips are doing this. And then I can also get the tilt. So her head is tilted upward, her ribcage has a gentle tilt upward this way, her hips are tilted down, as they have a tendency to do. Once I have this basic volumetric construction, then I can start putting in the lines. Now, notice I didn't measure anything. Really, the only thing I measured is the center line. I'm using generic proportions, and here are the proportions that I'm using. The volume of the head is 1. The distance from the head to the ribcage, about half a head. The ribcage itself, I'm drawing a volume, an egg shape that's about 1.5 heads. The distance from the ribcage to the hips, about half a head. The hips themselves are a sphere that is 1 head high, 1 head wide, so 1. And then I start the legs at the middle point. So the distance from the midpoint on the hips all the way to the middle of the knee, the kneecap, is approximately 2 heads. And then from the kneecap all the way to the heel, not the toes, to the heel, is 2 heads. So 2 heads, 2 heads. Those proportions are going to be close enough. Right? I don't have to measure the exact proportions, I just need to get relatively close. right? Again, with gestures, there's not enough time to make accurate judgments as far as the proportions. Okay, now let's put in our lines. When I put in my lines, I'm not going to be wild. I want my lines to be informative about how close something is, how light something is, and how hard or soft something is. So I'm paying attention to whether the form is in light or in shadow. On lighter areas, I'm going to make the line a little bit lighter. As they start going to shadow, I can darken the line slightly. I'm paying attention to where the line is in space. So her back is farther away. I can put in a lighter line. And it goes in this way and comes out this way, like this. So here the leg is in shadow. I can use a heavier line. So basically 3 reasons to vary the line quality in response to light and dark, to value, in response to hard or soft. So where you have a soft line, soft area, you can use a lighter line. And then where you have ankles, where you have knees, right? So at the ankles, I enjoy putting in a little bit of a heavier line that emphasizes the hardness of the form in that location. Gesture drawing is an excellent opportunity to study a number of different things beyond just the movement of the figure, right? So we use it to practice scaling the figure, to control how big the figure needs to be. We use it to practice proportions, obviously. Gesture, yes, gesture is obviously important. But it can also be used to develop an instinct for line quality. So in this case, I'm using my gesture to practice being spontaneous with the way I put down lines. Right? There's a system there. I'm not being random in my line quality, just putting darks wherever I feel like it. Right? There has to be a system to it. There has to be an order. There has to be kind of an inner logic to the way lines are put down. Okay, let's put in a few details here for the head. So here's her brow line. Her head is tilted back slightly. Again, whatever you guys have time for, you have time for. Don't rush. Don't worry about making mistakes. They're gestures. Mistakes are going to be made. But the main thing to keep in mind is that these quick studies are not ends in themselves. So if they turn out less than ideal, fine. They are practice for more ambitious, longer work. You're practicing various skills that you can apply to your longer stuff. So line quality, proportion, scale, and obviously gesture, also really important. Okay, let's put in her ear. We can indicate a little bit of her hair. And then if you have additional time, these quick studies can also be used to practice your shading. How? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is find my light breaks. So this model has very clear separations between light and dark. I specifically chose these poses for that purpose. And then we have cast shadows and body shadows. Cast shadows generally have sharp edges, and as I put in my light breaks, I indicate the fact that we have a sharper edge by putting in a clean line. Where we have body shadows, we're going to have softer transitions. In those areas, I'm going to create a hatch that more or less follows the form up and down. So along the leg, right, we have a body shadow. I'm using multiple lines to create a hatch. That gives the effect that there is a soft turn of form. Now, the shape of the body shadow is going to vary, the edge of the body shadow is going to vary depending on the abruptness of the turn. So near the knees, where we have bonier structures, angular forms, on the shin, where we have a shift that is fairly abrupt, almost angle-like, right? I'm going to make fewer hatching to sharpen up the shadow edge. So I'm using these quick studies as practice finding the light breaks, and also as practice paying attention to the edges of the shadow. So here we have a cast shadow, but it's sort of diffused. I'm going to fuzz up the line a little bit. On the opposite side, we have a cast shadow here, so there's a sharp line. And then we have a body shadow that has a soft edge. I'm hatching it ever so slightly. This can be done very quickly and records very crucial shading information. Again, the shape of the shadow and the edge of the shadow, without which the form is never going to turn appropriately. Okay, let's see, we have a little bit of a shadow shape here, a cast shadow, and then, okay, inside the eyes. Now, next step, again, if I have time, there's a little cast shadow along the breast here. If I have time, I'm going to shade this drawing a little bit in a very simple way. Simply by running a hatch that's about a 45-degree angle, and then where I'm seeing cast shadows, I run the hatch right up to the edge of the light break I've created. Where I see a body shadow, those are areas where the transition is softer, I'm going to run the hatch ever so slightly past my light break. Make sure that you're curving your hatching. Never apply a straight line, a straight hatch, across a round form. There are exceptions, specifically a hatching method called the parallel hatching technique that was used by the likes of Da Vinci. Very legitimate way of working. However, in that hatching method, which is not form following, the hatched lines are very closely spaced together, which more effectively fuses them into value. We're not noticing the fact that the lines are straight. There's no flattening effect. However, if you're going to crosshatch, make sure that your lines are curving so that they more or less are form following. Now, you can see that even at this stage, I have some pop, right? The forms are starting to develop. Why? Because I have all three properties that are required for form to develop. I have a fuzzy edge on the body shadow, I have a coarse shadow, I have a reflected light. So everything is there. I'm not saying the drawing is complete, but as a sketch, I'm starting to develop volume. If you're unfamiliar with the terms I'm throwing around, body shadow, cast shadow, and then within the body shadow, coarse shadows, reflected lights, I have a video titled Light Logic for Figure Drawing that covers all this stuff, which will clarify everything I'm talking about. So you should be familiar with those terms, because when you're shading, it's really important to understand what you're actually shading. What are the properties of light and dark? If you don't understand what's happening in terms of the shadow, it's very hard to shade effectively. So notice that the angle is more or less 45 degrees. The lines are curving a little bit to indicate the fact that I'm dealing with curves, curved shapes. So we don't have that flattening effect that happens when you introduce strong, flat shading into the figure. Okay, if I have more time, fantastic, we can add more detail. What should we do next? Well, we can strengthen some of the coarse shadows. So we do have a coarse shadow already. We have a little bit of pop. Now let's make it a little bit stronger in places, because our coarse shadows are going to vary depending on how abrupt the turn of form is, and obviously how strong the light source is. So here we have a coarse shadow. I'm going to choose an angle that's slightly flatter. Why? Because those areas are more front-facing than the sides. And as a rule, when you're cross-hatching, you want to apply more horizontal angles of hatch on front-facing forms. That's going to turn the form more effectively. Now, on this particular model, we forgot our belly button. There's going to be some places where the coarse shadows are a little bit lighter. Right? They're getting slightly bleached out, maybe. There's some places where coarse shadows are a little bit darker. I'm paying attention to that. That can be done fairly quickly. And you should see, hopefully, if I've done everything right, that once you introduce slightly stronger, slightly bolder coarse shadows, that our forms are starting to pop even more. Now, do I have more time? Fantastic. If I have more time, then I'm going to switch to my lighter area and start defining some of the halftones. Now, for that purpose, I need to work very, very light. This pen allows me to do that. If the lines are too heavy, sometimes working in what's called reverse writing is going to give you a lighter line. Not every pen is capable of doing that. This pen is. But I'm doing two things. I'm establishing some of the values in the lights, some distinctions. I can also use it to soften some of my shadow edges, which again is going to introduce an even stronger three-dimensional effect. So I have a little bit more time. Put in some details in the lights. It's going to make the volumes there even more 3D. Now, something really important. In my shadows, the hatching angle is more or less uniform. It's semi-form following. So I'm putting down curved lines that more or less follow the curvature of the form. However, in your lighter areas, your halftones have to be very precisely form following. Right, so I'm shifting, curving them to describe the surfaces. Why? We have more contrast in the lights, whereas in the shadows, the hatching sort of fuses together. It's not quite as strong individually, right? So your halftones in the lights, try to make them as form-following as possible. Again, time permitting. Okay, do you have even more time? Fantastic. Go back into the shadows and start picking out details. In the shadows, I'm picking a different hatching angle, more vertical this time, because usually darker values are going to be at the sides, and side-facing planes are generally need to be hatched at more vertical angles, right? That gives the impression that they're going back in space. So cast shadows can be a little bit darker in some places also. Right, so I'm showing distinctions in different parts of the shadow. We can make the hair a little bit darker. A little bit of contrast is good for gesture drawings. It makes them feel more expressive. So just because we're doing a short drawing doesn't mean I shouldn't try, if I can, achieve a full range of values. And then I can go back in and maybe reinforce some of the lines. One thing that's really important on standing figures, always, it doesn't matter whether the drawing is short or 5 hours long, try to introduce a little bit of shadow underneath the feet. It makes the figures feel like they're standing on something as opposed to just floating in space. So whatever the figure is standing on, leaning on, make sure you draw it a little bit. It gives the drawing more solidity. Makes the drawing feel less like it's floating in empty space. Okay, there is my first gesture. I didn't time it. I didn't know how long it took. But you notice that I used this study process as an opportunity to practice a number of different skills, not just capturing movement, right? So I definitely focused on gesture, but I was also practicing getting my proportions right, getting my scale, obviously that's the first priority. And then it's also an opportunity to practice your line quality, to practice finding your light breaks, practice finding your core shadows. Okay? Lots of skills can be developed really fairly rapidly using this quick study type exercise. Okay, let's pick a different pose. Let's try one that's a little bit more complicated. Let's do this one. Okay, let's get going. We're going to place her, let's place her right about here. Okay, so we're starting with our volume building. One thing that helps get the angle of the volumes is to line up your pencil with the center line. Right, so line up your pencil with the center line, and then transfer the angle over, and then draw an oval based on that angle. So that's going to be something like this for this figure. Cylinder for the neck. Her rib cage is going kind of more or less straight up and down, like so. And then her waist is going like this. Her hips are going out this way, like so. And then the cone shape of her leg is going this way, going like this. Again, don't measure anything. If you get it wrong, better luck next time. The key here is that we're using this quick study process to develop an instinct for proportion. And here is a really important point, at least something I feel is a fairly important point. Gesture drawing reveals your weaknesses. It reveals your natural tendencies towards making certain mistakes. Why? In longer drawings, we have time to measure. There are various checks for various mistakes. In gesture, we're going on instinct. So if you notice that in your gestures, you have a natural tendency to make heads too small or rib cages too long, whatever it is, that is your thing. That is the natural impulse that you have, a bad habit that you've developed that you should see if you can train yourself out of. Right? Gesture drawing, because it's so fast, there's no time to think, right, is an excellent test of what you know and what your natural tendencies are in terms of making mistakes. Okay, we have our volumes. I take a little step to make sure that things are right, but mostly I just race along. Okay, so let's start putting in our line work. Again, line work should be responsive. It should be informational, right? The objective is not just to put in an outline to describe the outside of the contour. I'm paying attention to where the line is in terms of depth, the hardness. So at the wrist, I can emphasize the hardness by putting in a darker line. Elbow, harder line. And I think, this is my opinion, this is a more valuable exercise than just putting down a bunch of wild expressive lines that aren't reflective of what's actually there. Right? These lines are meant to reinforce the drawing in terms of information, to add to the drawing. Right? Be specific about what you're seeing, respond to it, as opposed to just putting down a bunch of wild lines that seem gestural, expressive, but are inaccurate. So again, this is an opportunity to practice your lines. Now, if you want a full explanation of what I think are the priorities when it comes to line work, I have a video called The Rules of Line. You can check it out if you want. It covers lots of rules, not just line thickness, a few other ones that I feel are pretty important. But really, particularly for gesture, just focusing on thick and thin lines is a pretty decent way of going about things. Again, there's not a lot of time to think, so I'm responding. In longer drawings, often the students will thicken and thin out lines after the drawing is done. So they'll take their kneaded eraser and make those adjustments. Right, here I'm doing it as I'm going along. My pen stopped writing. I'm trying to be spontaneous about how I apply my line work. Okay, so here this arm is farther away and in light. So I'm going to use a lighter line here. Again, the way I use lines is never arbitrary. Right? There's always a reason for why hopefully, I may be exaggerating. Guys, take the time to render fingers. They also have a gesture to them. This is your opportunity to practice your hand construction. So just because you're doing a gesture drawing doesn't mean that you shouldn't put in the fingers. Again, if you have time. Also, natural tendency to avoid certain things, difficulty. So this head tilted back, it's not easy. Practice your construction. Right, don't avoid heads, fingers, toes just because you're doing a gesture. No excuse. You can do it with practice. Even ears, though I can't really see from this distance. Okay, so we've got our ponytail. Okay, time to shade. Find your light breaks. So I'm following the form vertically and putting down either a line or a series of lines depending on the hardness or softness of the forms. Be as specific about the shape as possible. Be specific. Right? Do not simplify. Why? Because just as the contours that you put down describe the form on the outside, your light breaks describe what's happening on the form on the inside. Don't simplify it. Part of what's interesting about a drawing, whether it's a gesture drawing or something that's longer, is the play of light on the figure, right? The way cast shadows transition to body shadows and vice versa. Those sharp and soft edges that are created by different kinds of light, right? That should be one of the areas of interest when you're studying the figure, one of the things you should be paying attention to. Right? Don't simplify it. Okay, so here we have a leg that's almost entirely in halftone. So I'm going to identify the fact that there is a shadow running here and on the other side. This is a little bit hard to see. Okay, so here it is pretty easy to see. And by the way, I specifically chose these references because they have a clarity of light, meaning that they have one strong single light direction where you can see very strong shadow shapes. If the reference has multiple light sources or is backlit, is not lit in an optimal way, it's going to be really hard to draw. Whether you're doing a longer drawing or a shorter drawing, it doesn't really matter. Right? It is a recipe for problems. Right? Always choose poses with a clear single light source. All right, even here we have a light source running this way. Let's see, we have a cast shadow here. Okay, all right, ready to shade. Again, throw a curved hatch, approximately 45 degrees. Where you see a cast shadow, run the hatch right up to the edge. Where you see a body shadow, run it past. So you can see that very quickly you can record some pretty subtle information. The fact that it's going sharper here and softer here. We did it in one fell swoop. The fact is, once I've indicated the light break, the drawing can be over, past the time limit. We'll still be able to get some pretty decent shading on it because I don't really need to look at the model when I put in these things. Right? I know exactly what the edge needs to be based on those initial indications that I put down. Now, having a model in front of you, better, obviously. But if you want to cheat, after the pose is over, after the fact, you go home and throw some shading onto your drawing. Okay, again, if we have more time, the priority is to emphasize the core shadows. The core shadows have to be there in order for the forms to turn. Pay attention to where the shading is. So here, as opposed to being more front-facing, maybe the core shadows could have a slightly more vertical hatch. Right? We have forms that are kind of going back in space a little bit. We can use a more vertical hatch. Don't obsess over hatching angle, however, especially in the shadows. They're not going to make or break the drawing. What will is obviously the proportions. The gesture, also equally important, but more importantly, the value. Right? So long as the value is more or less right, hatching, obviously important, and in the best drawings, everything's important. Right? So the old masters, they got the hatching right, they chose correct hatching angles, and also the value structures in the drawing are also incredibly accurate. So try to do everything, but really your accuracy in hatching, choosing hatching angles will come in time. Focus on getting the value right. That's more important. Okay, if we have more time, then go in to your halftones. Again, the halftones need to be very accurately form following. So pay attention to the forms. Right? This cannot be fudged. It has to be done accurately. So again, this process can be used for practicing lots of different skills, also making your initial indications of halftones. So there's another reason to do these kinds of studies. In case the reasons I mentioned weren't sufficient. So here we have the entire leg thrown into halftone. Let's do it. Okay, and again, don't forget, if the figure is leaning on something, on a floor, make sure you include a little bit of at least the cast shadow to ground the figure so they don't feel like they're falling over or just floating in empty space. A little bit of cast shadow is all it takes. Okay, let's make the hair a little bit darker. Strong contrast, always good for a drawing, whether it's a quick drawing or a longer drawing. Right? Make sure you include strong contrast. Okay, so here we have a cast shadow. Okay, I don't know how long that took, but again, for a gesture, for a quick pose, it's not too bad. Okay, let's do one more. So we're sort of increasing the difficulty of the poses here, and that is my advice. So when you're doing these, most of you that are watching these videos, you are doing self-study, right? You're watching YouTube videos, maybe you're signed up for whatever you're signed up for, but you're studying on your own. You have to be your own coach. So when looking for references, and there are lots of free references online, unfortunately they're still licensed, so I can't really share them with you. There's lots of free stuff. Quick Pose is a good one, for example. But start off with simple poses. So standing poses without a lot of twist or bend, and then little by little, more twist, more action, then kneeling poses, then poses that are foreshortened, where the torsos and limbs are kind of going backward and forward in space. Right? So gradually increase the difficulty just based on your comfort level. Right? Okay, so now we have a figure that is sort of reclining. I'm going to make sure that she has enough space here. So where am I going to place her? I don't want to get her in the way. Okay, so I'm going to place her right here. Hopefully I have enough space for her. Okay, so her head is going this way. Okay, her elbow's coming out this way, so I want to make sure I have enough room for her on the other side. Her rib cage is going like this. So again, gestures are an opportunity to practice capturing the angles of these forms. Okay, so it's going this way, and then I'm looking at her back, it's curving. So we have hips that are going this way. It might look like this pen is skipping. It's not. It's because I'm just barely making contact with the paper, which allows me to work light. Sketches can also be done in reverse writing. That's perfectly fine, but I don't want to work so light that you guys can't see what I'm doing. All right. Okay, so the cones for the legs are going this way. When you're doing these kinds of poses, check the alignment, right? So I'm looking at the horizontal alignment between the knees and the face. So her knee comes all the way up to the shoulders. But if you have an instinct for proportion, you know that the distance from here to here, from the starting point of the leg to the knee is about 2 heads, right? Okay, so it's going to be here like this. Again, on longer poses, these things are measurable, right? So I use a variety of different measuring techniques to get things right. With gestures, the brilliance of them is that I'm not measuring a thing, right? I'm just going by just pure instinct. And if I make a mistake, it's because my instincts are off and they need to be practiced. Okay, so actually I did okay with the placement. Okay, so our wedge shape here. It's going this way. Okay. All right, so her shoulder shape is right about here, going this way, and then we have a shape that's coming forward. Again, one of the reasons why it's so important to practice drawing these volumes is because what you're actually doing when you're drawing them is analyzing the figure in 3D, in three-dimensional space. So we're playing this little mind game where we're trying to force ourselves to think three-dimensionally. And by understanding what's happening to the figure in a really simple three-dimensional way, it allows you to draw it with much more solidity. Again, the pen is not skipping, it's just me working very, very lightly. I don't want my construction to overwhelm the line quality I put on top. Now, obviously, this can be done with a graphite pencil, and I often, when I really care about what I'm doing, use a graphite pencil for the construction stage, but I'm showing off. I'm trying to do these without any pencil construction at all, just to show that, yeah, it can be done. All right, so let's take a look at the rotation. It's going this way, this way. Okay, now let's put in our lines. The more convoluted the pose, the more clarity needs to be imposed with your line work. So I'm going to be a little more careful than I was in previous drawings, in paying attention to where things are in front and where there's things that are farther away. So this arm is coming towards me a little bit. I'm going to emphasize the darkness of the line quality here. We also have the benefit of this being a harder form, an elbow. So I'm popping the elbow forward by putting a darker line and killing two birds with one stone because we have a harder form here. And those darker, sharper lines help tell the viewer, we're dealing with a sharp elbow. Watch out. Stay away. Okay. Again, take the time to practice drawing fingers too. Right? Gestures are not just for capturing the big stuff, it's also to practice everything. Again, slightly different objective, right? Nothing wrong with gesture drawings. This is not to criticize people that specialize in gesture drawing. It's just a different way of doing things, a different way of understanding how to get better at this stuff. And look, it really depends on the kind of work you want to do, right? I see a lot of people practicing gesture drawings when their ultimate objective is to do really carefully rendered drawings. Look, gesture has its place. It allows you to capture movement, but if your intention is to work very slowly, then doing a lot of gestures might not be the best use of your time. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Right? It really depends on the kind of work you want to do. But one thing I find, again, not to criticize gesture drawing people, is that people that are really good at gesture drawing tend to be fairly weak at longer drawings. Right? Once you take them into the deep waters of a drawing that takes more than a few hours, they start getting bored. They get tired. They've basically done everything in the first few minutes. Right? Often the drawing is full of inaccuracies that can't really be corrected because they raced through it a little bit. So I think the idea is to work small, simplify the drawing process a little bit, but not necessarily speed up. Don't race through and create drawings that are inaccurate. Obviously, I'm simplifying quite a lot. I'm not able to render everything with a degree of detail that I would in a longer drawing, right? But I'm practicing those skills that are going to be necessary later when it's time to do longer work. Right? This sets me up to do my longer work better. While I'm drawing, I just realized that I haven't talked about the pen that I'm using, in case you're curious. Right? Sometimes there's not a lot of overlap between the people that are here for the drawing instruction and the people that are here for the pen and ink stuff. However, if you're one of those rare people that are interested in both, this is a Kaweco Liliput steel finish. And the nib in it is a number 5.5 Ultraflex nib from Fountain Pen Revolution, which has been cut down to fit the pen. So usually this nib fits into kind of standard number 5 sized housing units, a lot of different pens. Kaweco uses a number 2 size nib, but I've discovered that if you cut it down to the same size as the original Kaweco nib, it fits perfectly onto the feed and works, as you can see, not perfectly. It just stopped writing, but pretty effectively. Now, it does work better with other inks, because the ink I'm using is Platinum Sepia Brown, which is a little bit dry writing. So with other inks, I find that it actually works even better. But look, that's the case with most flex pens. They are persnickety things that require just the right ink, just the right feed. Right? This ink is really good. This Platinum Brown is highly transparent. It's dark when you need it to be. You can work really lightly with it. It's also a waterproof ink, so it can be used in combination with wash. However, I don't recommend it for that purpose. It's too light. So when you start applying washes, the line quality is not dark enough, and you'll find that it's sort of, you get a drawing that's too pale. So for line and wash, I recommend Diatramentis Document Brown. I have reviews of all this stuff if you're interested. Again, if your interests overlap and you're also interested in pen material. Okay, let's put in our light breaks. Again, everywhere we have a body shadow, we're going to put in a soft multiple hatched line break. Here the turn of form is a little more abrupt. I'm going to make it a little bit sharper. Right? I'm paying attention to cast shadows. Even though I'm working small, even though I'm working relatively quick, I'm not simplifying. Right? I'm practicing all the basic skills that I'm going to be called upon to use when doing a longer drawing. Again, a different way of doing quick studies, moving beyond just trying to capture gesture. And while these are definitely exercises and not ends in themselves, the result can be pretty beautiful. Right, so lots of examples of these kind of quick studies. These are great for doing compositional studies, for example. Right? If you're doing a study of a painting where we have multiple figures and you're trying to work out what their relationship is to other figures or the environment, right? This is a good way to go. So again, for your light breaks, hatch ever so slightly past your light break to create a soft transition. I didn't quite do that here, but I can do it. Okay, we have cast shadows. Shade right up against your light break to create a sharp edge. Now, there is a little bit more involved in terms of the type of lines you put down. I have a video, I think it's titled somewhat bombastically, like the 2 most important strokes in pen and ink. And they are something called the hard stroke and the soft stroke. What's the difference? Soft stroke is a stroke that starts thin and ends thin. So it has thin ends and thin beginnings. A hard stroke is more abrupt, like this. Right? Hopefully you guys can see the difference. When I need a soft transition, I use soft-edged strokes. Where I have a cast shadow, I run, so for example here, I have a cast shadow. I'm using a hard stroke that creates a hard edge. So, sorry to complicate things that are already fairly complicated, but that's one additional complication that we should probably touch on. Go see that video if you're interested in that kind of elaboration. Okay, so here I'm connecting patches of hatch together. This is a foreshortened leg. On foreshortened legs, make sure you're following the contour of the volume very closely, right? In order to emphasize the fact that it's coming forward. So in some places here, we have forms that are going up and down or side to side. Just choose a 45-degree angle, you're going to be fine. However, here, when we have forms that are coming forward, make sure the hatching is as form following as possible. That's going to be a little exception to the general rule that I've showed you. Follow the form in those situations. Okay, so here the shoulder needs to be in front of the head. I'm going to use a darker line here to pop that forward. That's important. And here we have a cast shadow. And we have increasingly side-facing forms here. So my hatching is going to be increasingly vertical. Okay, again, if you have more time, reinforce your core shadows. So go back in. In this case, the core shadow runs closer to the middle of the form. So we can use hatching that's perhaps a little bit more horizontal. And then hopefully you can see that as soon as I put in my core shadows, those darker core shadows, the forms start to pop even more. Right? They're really important. Again, you have more time. Let's put in a little core shadow here. Going this way, we have more time. Then go in and get your halftones. Again, make sure the halftones are as form following as possible. So I'm shifting them. I'm trying to describe surface detail. This can be done quickly. And, this doesn't take a lot of time. I just have to keep moving, keep changing the angle. Okay, again, don't forget to render a little bit of what the figure is seated on, a cast shadow. It's going to make the drawing feel a little more complete, a little bit more solid. Let's make the hair a little bit darker, just pop the contrast. Okay, and we're going to call this drawing more or less complete. Okay guys, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on my method for doing gesture studies, or if you don't want to call them gesture drawings, just quick studies of the figure. Again, this is an opportunity to practice a lot of different skills that are directly applicable to your long work. So really think of them less as ends in themselves, though they obviously can be beautiful. They could be displayed in a museum if you want, if that's your objective. But really, that's not the main point. The main point is to practice the initial steps that you use in setting up your drawing: scale, gesture, proportion, and then the initial steps you use in setting up the shading, finding the light break, finding your core shadows. Those are incredibly crucial skills that are directly applicable to your 2-hour poses, 4-hour poses, 15-hour poses. The main thing, and this is something that I want to emphasize, this is my last really important point: do not race. So definitely set a time limit and finish whatever you can within that time limit. But do not speed up, because that is a recipe for developing incredibly bad habits that are very difficult to undo. Proportional problems that take years to fix before you actually make the correction. But most importantly, they speed up your hand and make you sloppy in ways that are hard to correct. It's hard to slow down once you're used to working very, very quickly, right? So the way to speed up the process is to work smaller and simplify the construction process rather than actually speeding up. That's a really, really important point, and something that I think a lot of quick gesture drawing forces you to do. Right? A lot of people who do gesture drawings, they tend to start working really fast, and they can't slow down anymore. So work slow, not necessarily slow, just at the same pace you're used to working in your longer drawings. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.